In the comments of my previous Worst to Best video, I got all kinds of requests for what should be my next Worst to Best series, and the one which interested me the most was Opeth. This band has 12 albums with a very odd sort of trajectory that goes throughout them. They experimented in different styles, and their career has moved in a very different direction from where they started. So it would be interesting to go through all of these albums and to rank them worst to best. It's taken me 4 or 5 fucking days to listen to all these goddamn motherfuckers, and I've got like 3 pages of notes. So there's going to be a lot more cutting in this video than is usual on this channel. But before I get into talking about these albums, I really have to talk about Opeth, what they are, what the changes have been, and sort of give you a broad lens picture of how this band has evolved over time. So Opeth started off as an extreme progressive metal band. They were playing this very technical style of very dark, heavy-ass metal. On their first album, their sound is often considered to be somewhat black metal influenced, and after that they were often regarded as a progressive death metal band or simply an extreme progressive metal band. They sort of change and evolve over time, but in subtle ways that might not be immediately obvious unless you're deep diving this discography. As time went on, more and more progressive elements got infused into the music, and there were more and more softer passages and fewer of the extremely heavy death metal sections. And in the middle of their career, they put out one album that is entirely devoid of metal. It's just a soft prog rock album. And then, after their 9th album, they completely went in a new direction with their sound, getting rid of all extreme metal elements and becoming just a simple progressive metal band. Which is to say that their sound became much less abrasive and embodied more of a 70s progressive rock style, which really is what their last 3 albums have all been. There are still elements of the Opeth songwriting style in there, and they're completely different from the other album they had done in the middle of their career, which was just soft prog. These are hard rock and metal albums, just not nearly as extreme and without any of the death metal vocals that the band used to incorporate. All of that's important to know. This band has a 25-year career. There's a lot to take in here. If you want to just dive in and listen to some Opeth music before watching this list, if you haven't heard any of their music before, I've put together a Spotify playlist of what I consider to be the best Opeth songs. I limited myself to 2 per album just because these songs are long as fuck. Opeth songs average around 10 minutes, 9-10 minute range, so you know, just putting together even like 15-16 tracks, it's already like 2 hours, if not more, of music. Most of their albums are only 7 or 8 songs long. There's a couple of albums I didn't even include any songs from just because I didn't think they had enough good songs to make it on the list, but there are other albums where I, you know, put on the 2 that I like the most, even if they don't necessarily stand up to all the stuff that comes later, and they're in order of release date. So if you want to start with just the most accessible Opeth music, if you're not an extreme metal fan or you don't like metal in general, you should probably start with the songs from Damnation and work your way in from there. Or if you are a metalhead, it might be easier to get in with Ghost Reveries or Watershed. Their earlier albums are not as accessible, but if you are already a metal fan, you'll probably be fine to just start from the beginning and work your way from there. Now, I also need to clarify that this is a very, very divisive discography. There will be disagreements. This is not a list that people are going to look at and just agree with everything I say here, because the Opeth discography has always been highly divisive, not only because they've changed sound so much over time, but especially these last 3 albums have been very divisive within the fan base of Opeth. Like, some people who are fans of the band don't even like them anymore because of these new albums. Whereas the older ones, everyone's sort of got their favorite. There's only one Opeth album that's pretty much universally beloved by the fan base, and we'll get to that when we get deeper into the list, but there are some people who think their first or second album is the best. There are some people who think their 8th or 9th album is the best. Lots of people love Damnation the most. Lots of people love the new albums. You know, they're all some of the best-selling albums that Opeth's ever done, so clearly someone loves them, and they get pretty good scores, so on like Metacritic and shit. So yeah, I would say, you know, take all of this with a grain of salt, listen for yourself, make your own decisions. This is just my personal worst to best, but I got lots of reasoning behind it, and I'm sure some people will feel exactly the same way I do. Jumping right in, by far the worst Opeth album in my opinion is unfortunately their most recent album, 2016's Sorceress, the 12th Opeth studio album, the third in their new progressive rock style. This is the only Opeth album I legitimately found difficult to finish. I had a hard time listening to this entire album. I've really only heard it all the way through twice, and some people might say that it gets better if you listen to it more. I can't do that. I can't stomach this thing. Sorceress is just painfully boring. It just doesn't have any unique or interesting musical ideas. It's a pastiche of sounds from progressive rock of the 70s, and it is nowhere near as memorable as any great 70s prog rock album. It doesn't bring anything new to the table. It still kind of sounds like Opeth in that Opeth has certain chord progressions and stuff that are, you know, very unique to them, but it doesn't sound like the Opeth sound is doing anything to enrich the style of music that they're creating. At the beginning of the album, it actually sounds like it might go in a new direction. There's a pretty nice little piano interlude opening track, which I thought was okay, and then it goes into the song Sorceress, and the most notable thing about this song is this extremely fuzzy guitar sound on the track, which is kind of cool, kind of interesting. I don't think the song is all that good. It doesn't really do anything all that original once again, but at least that specific guitar sound was something totally new for the band, and that I can't name a ton of bands that sound like. However, after that, the album really just evolves into the usual 70s prog stuff. Now, as we dive into Opeth's discography, we will find that they are prone to going slow in songs. It's sort of what they're best known for, is the fact that their songs will go from crushingly heavy to very soft and sort of airy and mysterious, and they've done that really well in plenty of places, but the soft parts on this album are just so boring. It goes on forever in some of these little soft interludes that just don't hold my attention. Nothing jumps out at me and grabs me. And a problem which I'll be talking about on all three of the band's progressive rock albums is that the difference in volume of the quiet and loud parts is extreme. Like, if you're listening to this and you've got it at a comfortable volume for the loud parts, the quiet parts will be barely audible. And if you've got it at a comfortable volume for that, you start to, you know, get into the calm part, and more likely you're just gonna fucking gloss over it until the heavy stuff comes back in, you know, and it's like, oh, right, I'm listening to a song. That's how I feel a lot on these last three albums. But anyways, I'm not going to dwell on Sorceress too much. It's a difficult listen for me. I just don't enjoy it. I would give it like a 2 out of 10. Moving on from there, the next lowest on my list, and this may be a controversial choice, is Orchid, the first ever Opeth album. Released in 1995, this album is the root of the Opeth sound. You can hear a lot of what they were later going to be going for on this album, but it is very, very unclean, and it's not very focused, and I don't feel like they had really achieved the greatness of songwriting that they were eventually going to. This feels like a trial run, almost. It feels like we're just getting, you know, testing the waters of the Opeth sound, but it just feels so much less confident and so much less well realized, and also the production is very bad. This album sounds incredibly thin, and the most noteworthy part of it is just how shrill the guitars are. They're just like overpoweringly loud, and most of the album has dueling guitars, which would be a staple of the first two Opeth albums, and that's why this album is often thought of as like black metal, is because of the fact that it sounds like black metal, but honestly the songwriting doesn't really have that many black metal traits. I think it's just that the production is so bad that people mistake it for black metal because it doesn't sound like a prog album. The drums on this album sound kind of sloppy and clumsy in places. They sound really weak. They don't grab the attention. There isn't much of Michael Achterfeldt's clean vocals on this album, which would be a staple of Opeth's later work. One of the things they're best known for is that Michael Achterfeldt has both a beautiful singing voice and also an incredibly incredibly guttural, demonic, screaming voice. And you don't really hear much of the singing voice on this album, so there's less of that dualism that is, you know, a huge part of what makes Opeth so interesting. There also just isn't much of a sense of song writing on this album. Each track is around 9 to 10 minutes long, but all of them just kind of feel like a collection of song snippets rather than an actual song. Oftentimes, the song just kind of dips out and then goes into a new song idea, and there's not much of a sense of cohesion across the whole track. These songs, again, it's just like a collection as opposed to what they would later be able to do, which is to string these disparate sections together in such a way that it does feel like one coherent song. There are memorable passages on this album. There are some really great riffs. There are some really great vocal passages and stuff like that. There are moments that you will remember if you revisit this album again and again. And I have listened to it, you know, a number of times. It's not painful to listen to the way Sorceress was, but I just think that everything this album does would later be done much better in the band's future discography. So it's not one that I would find myself returning to all that much when there's so much better to offer throughout the rest of the band's history. Next up from there, I would put their 2014 album, Pale Communion, the second most recent Opeth album, once again, one that's in the modern progressive rock style. Well, I say modern, but it sounds like it's from the 70s. A lot of the same problems that I had with Sorceress also apply here. I don't like the quiet bits on this album, which are, in fact, way too quiet. I think the album's overall pretty boring, pretty rote. It just sounds like a lot of prog rock ideas that you've heard 1,000 times before if you listen to prog rock at all. Now, I will give this album that it's not as boring as Sorceress, and it's a lot more immediate even than Heritage, the album which came before it, because there's just a lot more intensity to it. There's a lot more like fun sort of rock songs on there. It's got a little bit more bite, but it also feels less deep than Heritage, whereas that album, clearly you can tell there's lots of stuff that you could pull out of it. By listening to it more, Pale Communion feels a little bit more stripped down, a little bit more, you know, rock, and like the surface is all that there is to it. There are fun moments on this album. I think I put a couple of the songs on my playlist of the best Opeth songs, which I did not do for the other two that I've talked about, but overall, this is a pretty boring album. I don't think I would return to it at all. It's not one that I would keep in my rotation, not so much because Opeth has done albums that do the same thing but better, which, I mean, they have, which we're going to talk about on the next album, but also because every prog rock band has done the same thing but better. It just doesn't stand out. And moving just a step up from there is the album which came right before it, Heritage. This came out in 2011 and was the first non-extreme Opeth progressive rock album. This is the first one that has elements of metal, but none of the extremely heavy sound and none of the deep guttural vocals. And just immediately with this album, you lose a lot of the uniqueness of Opeth. You lose a lot of what made them so distinct by cutting out the entire extreme metal element, because that really was a huge part of what was the draw of their music, was this epic dualism between super extreme metal and super light prog sound. And when you just give us an album that has kind of the same heavy moments, except they're toned down and sound kind of normal, it just doesn't have the impact. The opening track, The Devil's Orchard, you just don't have that sense of it being this super unique sound. It just sounds like a watered down version of Opeth. Much of it feels like they were translating the structure of what was traditionally their heavier, longer songs into a lighter prog rock sound, which is not the way that they used to do their lighter songs. It used to be on most of their albums that the lighter songs were in a very different style from the big, long, heavy ones, and that was kind of what made them stand out and broke up the album a bit. On this album, we are really taking that structure of the longer tracks and applying it to prog, and again, it just kind of strips away what made it unique. And honestly, just so much of this album is so slow and feels so soulless and pretentious to me. Like, there's just so many parts where it's just noodling, technical-sounding guitars that don't have any real emotion or punch behind them. It just feels like an exercise in playing complex riffs. There's nothing in there that really grabs my attention, particularly from the track Nepenthe onwards. That's where this album really nosedives and becomes super boring for me. But it's not to say that there's nothing good on this album. There are a couple of highlights. I think the song I Feel the Dark is by far the best thing to come out of this Opeth sound. The acoustic guitars at the beginning are super memorable. There's just this very tight riff and these dark, mysterious, tortured vocals from Michael Achterfeldt, where he's singing, I feel the dark. And that's what I want from his voice, is this dark, mysterious tone, which comes through on most of their softer music up until this point. But after this album especially, it just feels like Achterfeldt is doing pretty standard vocals. He's singing kind of soaring, almost nasally vocals on a lot of songs, and his vocals are pushed into the background and sort of reverbed, which is the opposite of when they sound good. His vocals sound great when they're clean and right on top of the mix, because his voice is haunting a lot of the time, and that really comes through on this track, which has some unique ideas. And the song that immediately follows it is like a straight up speed metal song out of nowhere. That's a pretty alright song. It doesn't really sound like Opeth, but it's not bad as far as speed metal songs go. But that's pretty much the nicest stuff I can say about Heritage. Overall, I find it to be a pretty boring and unimpressive album, and it was a big disappointment to me at the time that it came out. Moving on from there, we can get into some albums that I actually like from Opeth. From here on out, these are all albums that I would say are at least good and worth listening to and worth seeking out. And, you know, I recommend them. Starting with the band's 1996 sophomore album, Morning Rise. Now, I know for some Opeth fans, this is way too low on the list. This is sort of a cult favorite even within the Opeth fan base. There is definitely a sect of people for whom this is their favorite Opeth album. I have a number of complaints with it, and I really do think their sound continually got better from this point forward, but it is still sort of a classic album in the discography, one that is worth revisiting for sure. Compared to Orchid, we have slightly better production on this thing. The bass is audible, and there's not as much shrillness of the guitars, though we do still have the kind of overpowering dual guitar setup, which Michael Achterfeldt himself would immediately decry after this album, stating that, like, the sound was cool to him at the time, but he absolutely hated it pretty much from that album onwards and wanted nothing to do with it again. Michael's clean singing comes through much more clearly on this album than it did on the previous one, and there's a lot more of it. The melodies are a lot stronger and more memorable on this album, and more importantly, these songs actually have some coherence to them. Most of the songs on this album actually flow and feel like they were intended to be full songs as opposed to a collection of parts. I don't know how much of that was necessarily in the writing of the album, because this was written like immediately after Orchid. I don't know if Michael just figured out like how to do the cohesion better right afterwards, or if when they got in the studio, because this took a long time between writing and when it was actually made, if he just strung the parts together better in how they were performed. Either way, these are much more coherent songs. I would go so far as to say that the opening track on this album, Advent, is the first legitimately dope Opeth song. This is the first one that I've put in my playlist, and I think it's a pretty great track. But this album does have some issues still. The production still leaves a lot to be desired, and I think it kills some of the best moments on the album. Track 2, The Night and the Silent Water, is one that I've seen Opeth play live at a few of their shows, and it sounds fantastic live because it has this big, epic closing part where an acoustic passage slowly gives way to an electric one, and then Michael does this sort of repetitive singing over it in like a dark, whispery voice. But the way it sounds on the album just doesn't gel right. The slow melting of the acoustic into electric sounds clumsy, the audio mixing's just not quite there, it doesn't have the punch it's supposed to, and his vocals over top of the track just don't sound good. This effect would be done much better on later albums, like a very similar trick. Just here it doesn't quite gel, and I think the moment ends up not being powerful in the way that it is if you hear this song live. I also think that the centerpiece of this album, the 20-minute track Black Rose Immortal, is kinda overrated. This is a song that gets tons of credit and attention in the Opeth discography, I think mostly because it's 20 minutes long. It's hard not to be hype about this idea of, oh my god, it's a 20-minute track. But to be honest, this song has parts where it kind of just stops and starts again as though it's multiple songs, and I don't think there's a ton of coherence across the whole thing, and Michael Achterfeldt sings a lot on this one, and his voice just wasn't quite there yet, I think, at the time of this recording. Like, he doesn't sound nearly as good as he would on later albums. It's not really until the last track on this album, To Bid You Farewell, that we start to hear much more of what Achterfeldt's vocal and guitar style would sound like going forward. He kind of taps into the tone of guitar that he will be using for much more of the Opeth discography. And I mean, this is such a notable, like, guitar sound. Like, it's exactly what he plays like. He always has a certain feel to it, and like it starts to come through here where I don't really think it did on the previous songs. This was more, these albums sound like Opeth in the songwriting, but not so much in the actual sound of the albums. And from here on out, that just gets a lot better. So while I do think this is a solid album, it has lots of memorable parts, I don't think it is one of the best in their discography. Up next for me is Opeth's fourth album, Still Life, which came out in 1999, and it's only a little bit less on this list than the previous album, My Arms, Your Hearse, but we'll get to that one after this. This album had the best production sound out of any of the albums that had come out so far. It's much heavier and more pummeling. It starts to get a lot more evil sounding, which is something that I think Opeth really specializes in. Not only are their lyrics dark and foreboding and evil, but just the sound of the guitars, the choices of chord progression, and we'll really see this explode from their fifth album onwards, where they really master this evil, dark sound, but you can hear it really starting to come through on Still Life. I also think this is where Opeth really starts to sound badass. Like, one of their special traits is that they can pull out riffs that just sound fucking cool and monstrous and just make you want to fucking headbang and rip stuff up, and that really starts to come through on this album as well. I also think this is where they started to develop a lot more of a prog sensibility. Like, up to this point, we did have plenty of songs with, you know, complex guitar riffs and stuff like that, but we didn't really have the other instruments paid quite as much attention until this point. I feel like this is where we get into the real prog adventures that this band is going to be taking us on from here on out. You know, progressive rock is known for its 10-minute songs that take you through a lot of different moving parts that all kind of gel into one another, and I really feel like this is the album where that started to happen in a big way, and this sort of defined the sound that they were going to have on their best known albums, which we're, you know, gonna get into that stretch shortly after this one. But the album which came right before that, My Arms, Your Hearse, is the next on my list. It's their third album, released in 1998. The production is not quite as good as it is on Still Life, but it's definitely better than it was in the first two albums. We've ditched the dual guitar sound and the shrillness of the guitars. We're going for something a little bit heavier, and I think this was the first album where they were like really considered a death metal band. Overall, in comparison to the first two Opeth albums, this is where I think they really started to emerge with a lot more confidence in the uniqueness of their sound. This is the first album that has a completely non-heavy track on it in the form of Creedence, which is just a fucking soft song that, you know, really changes up the feel of the album. It feels like they're a lot more confident in the idea of going into soft passages for longer stretches of time and, you know, not having to be like all in on being a metal band. It helps, of course, that Michael Achterfeldt's singing sounds much better on this than it did on the first two albums. This is where we really start to appreciate how great of a singer he is, and the, you know, the recording's just a lot more clean. But we also get his best death growls yet. The vocal effects on the start of Demon of the Fall are legendary for how gruesome they sound, and that's always been one of the fan favorite songs for largely that reason. It's fucking gruesome. There's more memorable guitar solos on this album, and also the first of what I like to call the hypnosis riffs, where Opeth will latch into a really memorable sort of groovy riff that they'll just repeat for like minutes on end while you have like hanging dissonant guitars in the background, and it just like puts you in this altered state of mind, and they first start to do that on this album. But the most important thing about this album, and why I put it above Still Life, is the fact that the tracks are a bit shorter and I think a lot punchier. It really feels like only the good ideas made it onto this album, and all of the songs are much more coherent than they were before. Whereas on Orchid and Morning Rise, there are moments of really amazing sound punctuating lots of kind of whatever music, and I think Still Life has somewhat of the same problem, where there are sections of these 10-minute songs that are not that memorable. My Arms Your Hearse cuts it down and makes each track like a complete package. You know, not to say that all the songs are equally great, it's definitely a a mixed bag of an album, but at least there's a lot less redundancy in the ideas. I feel like it's more killer than filler. Now from here, we're gonna make it into the sort of golden age of Opeth. Their first 4 albums, while all of them have their strengths and weaknesses, feel like a build-up to their 5th album, and everything from their 5th through 9th are the ones that are probably the most beloved and well-remembered by Opeth's fan base. These are the albums where this band started to take off in popularity, where their sound got really defined, their production got much better, and most of these are the ones that their fans return to time and time again. Most people probably got into the band through one of these 5 albums, so get hype. The lowest on my list, but still a great album, is Deliverance, the 6th Opeth album, which came out in 2002. Deliverance is often regarded as the heaviest Opeth album, and in fact it was recorded side by side with Damnation, which is their album that is not heavy in the slightest. There was sort of a dualism thing going on with these 2 albums, where Michael decided to make one the heaviest thing in the universe, and then take all of his non-heavy ideas and put them on a different album. But it's not just that Deliverance is heavy so much as that it's dark. It has a very tortured sound to it. This is an album that feels like it's just rotting in your soul. This is a very grim album. There's a lot more double bass on this album and more blast beats than ever before. Certain tracks will have minutes of just a pummeling rhythmic double bass going throughout the song. From their 5th album onwards, Opeth would incorporate lots more of these just super memorable moments on their albums. You get stuff like the ending of A Fair Judgment, where after this incredibly virtuosic guitar solo, that's probably the best one they had on any of their albums yet, and this song that builds through a sort of calmer atmosphere where the main character seems to be dealing with, like, at times this very depressing and oppressive piano sound, and then sort of an uplifting feel as you reach through this guitar solo before it gets quiet again, and then all of a sudden a crushingly depressing riff kicks in. This is one of the most like gut-punching moments in music for me, where you take this song that builds over like 10 minutes in this emotional roller coaster ride of like trying to reach out from the pits of despair only to fall much deeper than ever before right at the end of the track. It is a haunting piece. Opeth also delivers much better hooks on this album than they ever had before. The ending of the song Deliverance actually has hooks that are memorable and stick in your head, and one of their most memorable riffs, which is another hypnosis riff that goes for about 2 minutes at the end of the song, and will get stuck in your head sometimes if you have listened to it enough. I also think that For Absent Friends is the best Opeth musical interlude on any of their albums. Their early discography has a lot of these instrumental tracks that just kind of break up the tone of the album. I don't find most of them that memorable, but this one is actually pretty great. However, the final track on this release, By the Pain I See in Others, I find kind of taxing. I've never thought it was that memorable of a song, and it's definitely a lot weaker than the rest of the album. Overall, it's a pretty solid release. I don't think I'd reach for it on the shelf as often as I would some of the other albums that I'll be talking about coming up, particularly the 5th album, because they're sort of similar in tone, but you know, it's still a solid release, and I could understand if it was somebody's favorite Opeth album. Moving up from there, these last 4 Opeth albums are my definitive favorites. These are the albums that I return to again and again and again. They're the ones I've listened to by far the most. They're the only ones that I would consider to be among my favorite albums in the Opeth discography. These are the ones that really stand out to me as like, this is why I consider this band to be a great band. At the bottom of the pile is Ghost Reveries, which is almost hard for me to put this low on the list because this is probably the one I've listened to the most times. It was the album that got me into the band back in 2006. The album came out in 2005. I was huge into it. I would listen to it all the time while playing World of Warcraft when I was a teenager. It was a really, like, you know, an album that kind of introduced me to prog metal and to extreme metal in a big way. I mean, Opeth was like the first band with screamed vocals that I was willing to listen to because they had the softer parts that I was really digging, and then I kind of came to love the heavy parts as well. And this album opens with what is easily my favorite Opeth song, Ghost of Perdition, a tour de force of all the things that make Opeth so great. It's got some of the best screamed vocals, some of the best clean vocals, this epic length of going through all these different moving parts. It's got some of their heaviest bits, some of their quietest bits that have these very soaring, epic feelings to them. I mean, this thing, everything about it's great. It's the perfect Opeth song, if you ask me. Like, if you wanted to just capture everything that's great about this band in one track, that's the one to go for. This album has easily the best production of any Opeth album up to this point, and it really has tons and tons of flourish. Most of the Opeth albums, if you read about their production, were kind of made quickly. They were kind of rushed. A lot of the times they didn't really get a chance to even practice the albums before they went into the studio. They hadn't been well rehearsed. They would just kind of keep recording it till they got it right once they were there. Some of them were written in the studio, and Ghost Reveries was the first one in quite some time where it was actually written long beforehand, well rehearsed and practiced, and then performed. And I think that really shows in the tightness of the playing here. There's just so many little flourishes that really bring this thing to life in a big way. But the best thing about this album is that this is where Opeth really started to involve more variety, and in my opinion, this is where they developed the sound that I really wish they had kept going forward with, because up until this point, Opeth was mostly about this extreme metal sound, which would occasionally break into like lighter prog bits, but those two sounds were very consistent. You were either getting the extreme metal or the light prog. This is the first album where we kind of can go in any direction, where songs have a little bit more inventiveness to them, where the light parts all sound different from one another, and the heavy parts sound different from one another. At the opening of the song Beneath the Mire, we get sort of a new kind of sound from Opeth, and the song following that, Atonement, is a straight-up psychedelic rock jam. Harlequin Forest has some of the best sung vocals on any Opeth record, and it also has another one of the big memorable hypnosis riffs towards the end of the track. It's another, not unlike Ghost of Perdition, a big adventure, a prog song that takes you through lots of different moving parts, and another of my favorite songs by the band. But my second favorite track on the album is what I consider to be easily the best of Opeth's quieter songs, which is Hours of Wealth. This is a 5-minute, super duper subtle, super duper stripped back and minimal guitar song, which just features guitars, keyboards, and vocals that are all soul-touching. It opens on a long and haunting guitar melody, proceeds into some very memorable and gripping and lonely lyrics from Michael Achterfeldt, which are beautiful in his voice, and then goes into what I think is by far his best guitar solo ever. One of my all-time favorite guitar solos at that. Now, unfortunately, not all of this album is equally memorable, and it does have one of the worst Opeth songs of all time, the Grand Conjuration. This 10-minute track is just so much more repetitive and uninteresting than anything that the band had put out to this point. As far as 10-minute tracks go, at least. I mean, this thing goes on for a significant portion of the album, and it's not very interesting. There is kind of a memorable chord progression in there for, like, the main central riff, but it would actually get used again on their next album in a better song that does the sound I think they were going for here a lot better. And the Grand Conjuration was the single. It kind of feels like maybe they made it to be a single or something, but I also think that part of the problem here is the way that Opeth's production sounds, because Opeth has never been extremely risky on the production front. They usually have pretty straightforward sound on their albums. Only occasionally do we get like weird vocal effects here and there, or like something that really strikes out as like totally different from just the sound of the guys playing the instruments. And one of the things that has been incorporated into a lot of their songs throughout their discography is these sort of noisy, hanging, reverby guitars in the background that are like just going over the length of part of a track. And the Grand Conjuration has this towards the end of the song. Now, if you hear this song performed live, that part is way the fuck louder. Like, it's this overwhelming wall of guitar noise that actually sounds really cool over this hypnotic, repetitive riff that goes through the entire last couple minutes of the song. But you don't really get that effect on the actual album. It's pushed so far into the background that it just ends up being kind of sleep-inducing and boring. So we get, yeah, again, one of the most boring Opeth songs. It's pretty disappointing, and it drags the album down for sure. And again, not every single part of every song is super memorable. Parts of Harlequin Forest aren't that great. Parts of Beneath the Mire or Baying of the Hounds are maybe not as memorable. But overall, it's still a very solid album. Placed as my number 3 favorite Opeth album is probably the most beloved album in their discography among their fans, Blackwater Park. This is the one that appears on the most favorites lists. It's the one that is usually pointed to when people talk about what's good about Opeth, what's unique about them, why they are cool. This is the album you will get recommended if you talk to an Opeth fan, and for great reason. It's one of their best albums. I think it's the first one where they really emerged as like a great band that you needed to pay attention to. It's their 5th album, released in 2001, and let me dive into it. First of all, the production on this album is great. It's the best it had been up to that point. It's not as good as Ghost Reveries or the albums that would come after that, but like, it's getting there. It sounds really nice. And the musical transitions are just fucking solid at this point. Up until this point, there just wasn't that sense of coherence, again, across an entire song. Sometimes it really felt like you were just breaking into something else, or the transitions were clumsier and just not as interesting. From this album up through the next few, when they transition between 2 different riffs, it's with a epic drum fill or just some kind of flourish that really sells this transition and makes it feel badass. This album has lots of different experimental vocal sounds. It's got just a little bit more edge to it than the previous albums in terms of like creativity. It's also got what I think is the first really memorable of the calm Opeth songs in the form of Harvest, which is almost out of place on the album because it's like somewhat hopeful sounding in a way. I mean, it's still kind of a dark sound, and this album is very dark, but it's the first of these songs that appears on an otherwise heavy album that I actually took notice of. Granted, it's not as good as Hours of Wealth, but you know, not many things are. This album also has Opeth first starting to really play around with the structure of their songs in interesting ways. I talked before on the Deliverance album about the song A Fair Judgment, and how that song had this long build-up to this really crushing climax. And that album came after Blackwater Park, but Blackwater Park is similar with songs like Dirge for November, which is a song that starts off very quiet and sad and just kind of plays through these lonely sounding acoustic passages before just hitting you with this brutal guitar riff that is just depressing and oppressive and horrible, and then some of the most guttural vocals that Achterfeldt has ever used. That goes for a few minutes, and then we cut back to the softer passage, and really it feels like one complete song. Like, there's not even tons of movement throughout this track. It's really just like this one idea, which I would say something similar about A Fair Judgment. Like, obviously there's multiple parts to these, but not in the sense of just kind of stringing together a bunch of riffs or stringing together a bunch of musical ideas in the way that most of the longer Opeth songs do. This is where I feel like they started to do more conceptual tracks, which are usually my favorite Opeth songs, so I'm really glad that they started doing that. This is where we started getting a lot more of these long passages of just sustained guitar sound hanging in the background, or just like really exploring a riff all the way through in a way that the first 4 albums weren't doing as confidently. The big epic moments pay off really well on this album. There's just tightness to all of it. It just really explodes when it needs to explode and is captivating when it wants to be. It's also got some of the most memorable riffs. The Funeral Portrait has one of the stickiest riffs of all time. You will get this riff stuck in your head. You will want to hear it again when you listen to this album. I mean, again, Opeth has always had impressive sounding riffs, but most of them weren't necessarily things that were going to like lodge into your skull up until this album. So I really think this is where Opeth took off, came into their own. It's one of their best albums. I only really put it above Ghost Reveries because it doesn't have any big weak points, whereas Ghost Reveries really falls flat in certain areas, whereas others are just unbelievably great. I think that this album is consistently at a high level of performance for Opeth. Moving along, my second favorite album, and another one that is very beloved by the fans of this band, one of the most important albums for them growing into the popular musicians that they are today, is Damnation, the one that is entirely soft, the one that has no heavy elements to it whatsoever. It's even softer than their newest 3 albums, which really gives you pause for thought when you think, okay, I know Opeth isn't shit now just because of the fact that they're not doing heavy stuff anymore. They've proven they can do that. It's just because it doesn't sound exactly like every other 70s prog band. Even though this is very much a 70s prog album, but not one that's about the sort of long and evolving song structures that most of Opeth is about. In fact, these are much more normal sounding songs, structurally at least. Not that any of them's exactly like just a verse, chorus, breakdown, chorus kind of thing. Like, some of them do have multiple verses and chorus iterations, but they are willing to really go on for a lot longer and explore their riffs in more detail. There are long musical passages in them, so, you know, they're still sort of inventive in prog, but there's not like a attempt to overwhelm you with the technical prowess of the album. It's really more about the sound, and the production is beautiful on this album. The bass tones are really warm and just comfortable. It's got just such a nice sound to it, even though it's still kind of dark and mysterious. You know, this is not a heavy album by any definition, and I wouldn't even really say it's sad or emotional. It's just got this kind of briskly mysterious tone. It sounds like an abandoned village full of ghosts or something. Michael Achterfeldt sounds the best that he ever has on any album. His vocals are just beautiful on this. They're very clean in the front of the mix. And there are no bad songs on this album, by the way. This is all killer. Every song is good. Now, this doesn't have any of my favorite Opeth songs. I wouldn't say any of them like super stands out as like, oh my god, that song's incredible. Maybe the opening track, Window Pane, which is fairly memorable in its own right. But none of them are bad. It's all good music. Songs like In My Time of Need and To Rid the Disease have the stickiest hooks that Opeth has ever sung. Up until this point, again, they haven't really been known for having any memorable choruses or anything. I would say that they start to develop some more of those on albums like Ghost Reveries and Watershed still to come, but there's definitely like the emergence of that on this album, as well as memorable riffs and songs that do the hypnosis riff thing on an acoustic guitar. And what's really impressive about this album is not only that it maintains the sort of atmosphere of Opeth's music up to this point, which I don't think their latest 3 albums do nearly as well. Like, this still feels very evil and dark and sort of seedy, but it's also impressive how much variety there is in the songs, considering that they all have like the exact same instruments and tone to them. Like, this sounds like, you know, could just be the guys jamming on the same instruments the whole time, and in fact there's a live video where they perform the entire album, but with, you know, maybe some switching between electric and acoustic here and there, but like, there's so much variety in the style of songs on here. The structure is often very different between different songs. There's just overall different, like, levels of intensity. Some of them are a little bit more proggy, like the opening track Window Pane. Some are a little bit more like pop songs. Some are just like experimental. Some have no vocals. Some sound like jam sessions. Like, it really runs the gamut of like what they could do with this sound in a pretty short package. This is easily the shortest Opeth album. So yeah, it's a really solid release, and I think this is probably the best album for getting new people into Opeth if they're not metal fans, because like, I think a lot of Opeth fans are not necessarily like big metal heads. Definitely not people who are into like extreme metal with deep guttural growls and stuff. And lots of people who get into their music start with this album, and they're just so like enchanted with it that they go and check out the other stuff. And because, again, it is so consistent with the tone of Opeth, especially with the softer passages, that, you know, you'll kind of recognize what you liked about Damnation in the rest of their music. So as long as you can get used to the death screams, then, you know, that's kind of how I did it. Like, when I got into them, I found Damnation and Ghost Reveries. Damnation was the first one I like really deeply got into, and then I moved from there into Ghost Reveries once I could handle the vocal delivery a little bit more. So yeah, I think this is a great starting point for new Opeth listeners, and one of their best fucking albums. But my outright favorite Opeth album, the one I've listened to the most and come back to the most over the years, is Watershed, their 9th album, which came out in 2008. Watershed really is a watershed moment in Opeth's sound, because I think this album captured everything that the band had been doing up to this point and brought it all into one complete package. This is an album that goes in a lot of different directions. No two tracks really sound alike, even though it's one of their normal heavy albums. Whereas an album like Blackwater Park is very consistent across its run, and whereas Ghost Reveries really started to break things up, this one is like steadfast in that. It really breaks things up. Every song is very different. And to me, it's just kind of a tour de force of everything that's good about the band. It opens with this really haunting intro track that's just sort of a calm song with a actual duet sung between Michael Achterfeld and a female singer. First time we've ever had guest vocals on an album, so that's already a huge change up. And that goes right into Heir Apparent, which is possibly the heaviest Opeth song. Like, while this may not be their heaviest album, Heir Apparent is just unbelievably massive sounding and brutal at the beginning, with some of their tightest, heaviest riffs to date. And that goes right into the Lotus Eater, which has this really memorable hummed intro before breaking out into blast beats with singing over top, which is totally unexpected and cool. Then it goes into these wild prog breakdowns in the middle, where you've got like really badass keyboard solos going on, just lots of breaks into really interesting groovy sounds in a way that you would usually hear on like a Mastodon album. Like, there's a lot of similarities to like Crack the Sky on this track, and it just flows incredibly well, goes into this weird finale with all these like tracked like crowd vocals and stuff. There's just a lot more experimental shit on this album than there is on any of the others. Like, even on albums like their latest 3, where there seems like there'd be a lot of room for this kind of experimentation, it does not come up in the droves that it does on Watershed. But even more impressive than those songs so far is Burden, which I think is the best like light prog song that this band has ever done. This is just a really emotional song that has epic, soaring keyboard solos, and one of the best guitar solos the band has ever done. It goes on for quite some time with these really emotional vocals, and I think it's like probably the most heartfelt song that the band has ever produced. It's so much better than their last 3 albums. It sounds like Damnation, but like leveled up a little bit, you know? Like, the sound is very similar to that album, but the soaring keyboards and guitar solos, which they sort of imported from their heavier songs, really bring this one to life in a big way. It goes on, too, with this ending that sort of trails off into weirder, darker, more mysterious directions until ending with this really bizarre and intricate, out-of-tune acoustic guitar riff that I like a lot. And that goes into Porcelain Heart, which is just pure gothic horror in a metal song. This is what I think they were trying to do on the Grand Conjuration and just kind of failed at, because the big riff from that song kind of reappears here in a much better context. And this song is just really like haunting and memorable in that it feels like you're exploring a spooky house, which is actually what the music video is, exploring a spooky house. But like Opeth has always had this undercurrent of gothic horror. I mean, that's what most of their lyrics are about. Not that I really pay much attention to Opeth's lyrics because they're all kind of very similar to one another, but the feeling of it has always been about gothic horror, and this song communicates that perfectly. There's a couple of things that I think really make this album work. Other than that it's so experimental, there's also the fact that the song lengths have been cut down a little bit shorter once again, and I think that really benefits the band just as it did on My Arms Your Hearse, where there's just less fucking around. Ghost Reveries had a problem with some of the songs going a little bit too much in the fucking around direction. This one really reins it in, keeps the tracks to just what they need to be, and they all feel very tight and varied because they're even more experimental in spite of the shorter length. I also think that the addition of drummer Martin Axelrod was a huge deal on this album, because while the drums have been pretty solid after their second album, Martin Axelrod is crazy technical, and he can go into these really insane fills, really great like intros and stuff like that. You know, it's just kind of a step up in the way that the drums sound, and I think they really do a lot on this album with all the crazy change-ups that he does and shit like that. And I mean, there's a lot of focus put on his drums on their later albums too. Unfortunately, they're just kind of playing, you know, prog music that like we've heard 1,000 times, so it's not as memorable as hearing those kinds of drums under these like crazy heavy riffs and really huge explosive sounds. And that's what makes this album so great. Now, the couple of tracks following Porcelain Heart I don't think are as memorable as the four that preceded them. Hex Omega and Hessian Peel are not bad songs by any stretch, but to me, you know, this album, all their albums are super fucking long, and this is one that you can kind of phase out after Porcelain Heart, in my opinion, but like, it's still an overall really solid album. Even the bonus tracks on this one I like a lot. In fact, a lot of these albums have bonus tracks which are like covers and shit, which are always great. I didn't include any of that in my ranking here, but like those are all worth a listen to, and they really, you get to see Opeth like take on other musical styles than theirs, which is usually a treat. But in any case, Watershed is my favorite. That's my worst to best of Opeth. I know it went on for fucking ever, but consider the fact that last time 5 albums took me an hour. This time 12 albums took me an hour. I'm getting better. Anyways, thanks again for watching. Let me know your ranking of Opeth albums in the description. Tell me what you thought of my ranking. Tell me why I'm wrong or right. And look forward to the next one. I'll probably do a poll for which one should be the next worst to best. I'm definitely not gonna take on another fucking 12 album band, but I'll put a poll down below. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.